Good afternoon or good morning, and let me start by just introducing myself quickly. My name's Andy Gillies. I'm a freelance conference interpreter and I work in the English booth, and my language combination is English A, French C, German C and Polish C. Let me thank the organisers for asking me to speak today, and I'll do my best to make it manageable for the interpreters. I've already done part of that by not leaping straight into the topic. I have it on very good authority that if a speaker leaps straight into the speech without any sort of introduction, it can be quite challenging for the interpreter. So I hope you've eased into it now. You've got used to the sound of my voice. I'm about to get into the topic. So what am I going to talk about today at your mock conference? Well, I thought I would give you my angle on interpreting in general, your first steps in the interpreting world, and the Parisian market. I should perhaps start with a little disclaimer though. Because of the language combination that I've told you about, I'm not necessarily a typical Parisian interpreter. I don't work into a B language. And the large part of the Parisian market is an A-B market, but we'll come back to that. Another disclaimer, I'm in the English booth, and the English booth, because of English's status as a global language, has a rather easier time finding work, shall we say, than other booths. So my experiences may not be typical, but I hope that all the same they will be useful. So I'm going to begin with a couple of sort of general remarks about interpreting and pointers, my view of things that you may come across, just so that you're warned in advance when you do come across them. And then I'm going to say something about the Parisian interpreting markets, and you'll notice that I use a plural there because it's not really one single market, but I'll come back to that. And if we have time, I might touch on, of course, the issue of AI interpreting, which seems to be very fashionable at the moment. So what do new interpreters need to know as they go out in the market? Well, I think if I had to give one bit of advice, it would be really well prepared for the work that you're getting into. Be prepared so that you can be as good as you possibly can. Because one way or another, your reputation in interpreting is really, really important. You want to make a good impression on people. And that means not just doing your best by being prepared, but of course it also means turning up on time, being polite, asking intelligent questions. You're allowed to ask questions, but don't ask stupid questions. Don't ask questions that you could have found the answer to very easily. Try not to annoy people. This is all the more important in the world of interpreting, because interpreting is a tiny world, and you will see the same people again and again over the years. And one day you might need something from them. So at the very worst, it's always good to be cordial with people. Now let me look at a couple of issues that are always controversial discussion issues, but which you're going to be faced with as you move out into the interpreting market. And those are the question of domicile, so your professional address, where you base yourself, daily rates, or the interpreting rates that you charge, and remote simultaneous interpreting, so interpreting from home. So let me start with domicile, your professional address. What does that mean? Well, it means that if you live in Paris and somebody wants to give you work in London or Brussels or Munich, or even further afield, they have to pay your travel on top of the fee that you would usually charge. And so anywhere that isn't Paris, for me, for example, will mean that I get a fee and I charge my travel expenses. Now, this tradition, shall we call it, this convention, dates back to the 60s and 70s when interpreting was just starting to get organised, and the idea was that it made competition amongst interpreters fair. Now, to my mind, it's quite a pain for customers to be getting lots of different travel bills for different amounts from different interpreters on the same team of interpreters. In my opinion, it was that it would be easier if we just picked a flat rate for everybody. Instead of working for €700 in Paris, you say, oh, if I'm going to Brussels, then it's 1,100. But there's a long discussion we can have about this. It's quite complicated and also quite political. I think the important thing for you starting out is that you only have one domicile. And if somebody offers you work in Brussels, then whatever price you accept for that has to include the travel costs. So let's imagine that you work in Paris for €700 a day. You can't work in Brussels for €700 a day because you're going to have to pay your travel. And if that were to come out of the 700, then you'd only be earning 450 to go to Brussels. Now that might seem like a lot, but it's considerably less than you can earn in Paris, and it's less than the Brussels interpreters would be charging. So you're kind of undercutting yourself and undercutting the colleagues in Brussels. The other important thing is that because it's a convention, a lot of more experienced interpreters very much believe in the concept of domicile, and therefore they will be very, very disinclined to work with people who have 2 separate domiciles, or 3 or 4, who just work anywhere for the same rate. And because, as I said a moment ago, reputation is very important, you don't want to be upsetting people who you might later need to rely on for work or for help in an interpreting booth. But as I say, it's a complex and political matter. Best is probably not to get into an argument with anyone about it until you've had a few years to think about it, and just to accept that for the time being that's the way things are. The next issue I want to talk about were daily rates. Now here in Paris, again, tradition says that you should only charge for an entire day. Some people will have a half-day rate, which might be about 2/3 of their daily rate. Nobody I know in Paris would charge by the hour. And it's considered really a little bit demeaning for the profession to charge by the hour. My angle on it is this, that there is an inversely proportional ratio between the length of the meeting and the amount of preparation time. What do I mean? If I have a 1-hour meeting, I might comfortably prepare 2 or 3 hours for it. So the ratio of preparation to meeting time is 3:1 or 2:1, with more preparation time than meeting time. But if I have a 2-day meeting, I might do 1 day's preparation for a 2-day meeting. So the ratio is 1:2. So the longer the meeting, the less, or that ratio of preparation to meeting time. So very short meetings of an hour or an hour and a half are actually quite expensive in terms of preparation, and you should be considering that as you charge a fee. There's no good charging for an hour if you've spent 3 hours prepping it. That's half a day again. But again, be aware that in Paris people are quite sensitive about the issue, and a lot of interpreters will only charge full days and nothing less. The logic behind that is quite simple. If you were to charge for half a day, take half a day's work, you still couldn't do another day for another customer. So you've lost a day's work. So you demand a day's work's fee for that entire period. Again, one could argue that's not the client's problem, that's the interpreter's problem. But that's a bigger debate for another conference. And the last general issue I want to talk to you is about remote simultaneous interpreting. And this is an interesting spanner in the works of many of our interpreting conventions, not least of all Domicile that I was talking about earlier. Clearly, if you're working remotely, the idea of having a professional address becomes an irrelevance. It doesn't matter where you live, as long as you have a good internet connection. But I'm not going to get into that discussion again, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of things about remote interpreting that you might not be aware of. And I would actually like you to be wary of working too much in remote rather than in person. Why? Well, when you're working from home, you're generally working on your own. There may be another interpreter working with you, in theory, but they're not with you in the room, and so they can't help you. And when we start out in interpreting, we are very much dependent on the person in the booth with us to help if we get in trouble with terminology or with sort of conceptually what's going on in the room. We can ask them. In RSI, remote interpreting, that's much more difficult because you're not in the same room with the person. Which leads me to my next point, which is because of that distance, it's also much more difficult to get better. A lot of the best tricks I learned as an interpreter came from listening to really good, experienced interpreters working with me, sitting next to me, and I was just jotting down great solutions to difficult expressions, things that were difficult to translate or interpret, and I was just jotting down great things I heard from my more experienced colleagues. That too is much more difficult in RSI. Listening to the floor, the room, and listening to your colleague is far more tiring in remote simultaneous interpreting than it is in a meeting room. Another problem of this split between the interpreters, they're not in the same place. I think ISIT calls this non-co-located RSI. So the interpreter's not in the same room, even though they're working on the same channel, is that you often don't have terminological consistency between different interpreters working into the same language. And that's not much good for the customers, but it comes from the fact that interpreters tend to listen to their colleagues less in RSI than they would if they were sitting next to them in the room, where you're kind of obliged to listen to the person you're working with. Then there's this question of reputation. You want people to think you're a good interpreter. You want them to listen to you work and say to other people, oh yeah, I worked with them. They're a good interpreter. That doesn't happen so much either in RSI because you don't often know who you're working with, or they're not on the same market as you, so they can't recommend you to the right people. And lastly, there's the question of mental health. Sitting at home on your own, looking at the computer screen all the time is not necessarily a great idea. Now, look, I noticed that time is flying on. I had said I was going to talk about the institutional market and the Parisian market. I'll perhaps do that in a second part of the speech, but I will call it a day initially there. Perhaps you might want to ask some questions and what have you. So I'll give the floor back to the chair. Thank you, Chair. And we'll perhaps come back to the Parisian market in a moment.